Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas y muy bienvenidos a una nueva charla técnica del programa de extensión e innovación de UC Davis Chile. Hoy nos encontramos acá para hablar sobre suelo vivo, el uso de cultivos de cobertura, disculpe. Y les recuerdo a todos que esta charla va a ser grabada y va a quedar disponible en la plataforma de extensión de UC Davis Chile. Y también les recuerdo que esta charla contará con traducción simultánea donde ustedes podrán elegir el idioma desde el botón interpretación, ya sea inglés o español, según su preferencia. También al final de la presentación podrán hacer sus preguntas y dejarlas en el botón de preguntas y de respuestas para que sea respondida por el especialista al final de la presentación. Como les comentaba, la charla de hoy está enmarcada en el programa de Transversal de Suelo Vivo, que es el uso de coberturas vegetales, y hoy nos acompaña Richard Smith, quien es asesor en cultivos hortícolas y malezas, con experiencia en proyectos en el uso de cultivos de cobertura del Centro de Extensión de la Universidad de California, eh, y que nos va hoy día a hablar sobre los cultivos de cobertura y como una herramienta fundamental para el manejo sustentable del suelo. Así que le doy la bienvenida a Richard. Richard, si puedes prender tu cámara, por favor. Y te dejo la pantalla para que puedas compartir tu presentación.
Okay.
Ahí está.
Can you see it?
Muchas gracias.
Great.
Sí, se ve, ok.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm a retired farm advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension. I worked in Monterey, Santa Cruz, and San Benito counties. Those are counties here on the central coast of California. And mostly worked in vegetable crops over the years. And as I understand, most of you are working in tree fruit. But I have done a little bit of work working on cover crops in vineyards, and I'll make reference to that because that is of interest to you, and I think more maybe some of those examples will be more relevant to your experience and what you're dealing with in your work. And but the whole concept of cover crops, why we are so interested in this subject, is because of the types of benefits that cover crops can provide to crop production, but also just to soil health. And when we talk about soil health, we're talking about it's something that's there's a lot of discussion about what exactly is soil health and what benefits do we get from it. But I think there's no question that a healthier soil is more productive. It may even be able to resist or push back on soil-borne diseases in some situations. Not always, but in some situations it can, but it's certainly more capable of cycling nutrients and may have better water holding capacity and infiltration and all of these kinds of things. And so the thing about cover crops is that they are kind of a fundamental practice that we can undertake to improve the health of soil. So when we talk about the benefits of cover crops, they provide carbon to the soil, and this carbon, of course, is the fundamental building block of soil organic matter. And we can't underestimate, the importance of getting carbon into the soil. And part of the reason is that, when we're farming soils, we're tilling, disking, doing all of these things to soils. What ends up happening is we end up losing carbon from the soil, because each tillage, each pass of a tillage implement actually exposes carbon to atmospheric oxygen, and actually accelerates decomposition of carbon from the soil. So in order to combat that, we have to make sure that we work to add carbon to the soil. So cover crops provide a very critical practice where we can do that. And there's other things you can do, of course, crop residues, adding crop residues, compost, organic fertilizers, manuring, all of these kinds of things have carbon, and they also add carbon to the soil and improve the health of the soil. Now, one of the things what we're concerned about in vegetables is residual soil nitrates and leaching of nitrates to the groundwater. Now, I'm not so certain that's as big of a concern for the tree crops, but this is one thing that cover crops can do, is they can scavenge nitrate from the soil and then sequester it in their biomass. And then as that biomass is reincorporated into the soil or mulched onto the top of the soil, it slowly decomposes and becomes a source of slowly available nitrogen. And that's a good thing. Legumes, I think everybody knows that they provide an input of nitrogen to the soil because of their association with soil rhizobia. They actually take nitrogen from the air, which is in a triple bonded form, and they break those bonds and make it into a form of nitrogen that the plants can use. And so that's a benefit. And I think that might be of interest to some of you, because planting legumes in orchard systems is maybe one of the ways that you can increase the nitrogen, the fertility of nitrogen in the soil. Then the other thing about cover crops is that they also, as I alluded to earlier, they can break the cycles of plant pathogens. Not always, but having that carbon in the soil stimulates the microbial activity of the soil and helps the soil, makes the soil less susceptible to outbreaks of uncontrolled outbreaks of soil-borne pathogens. The other thing is that they can also provide habitat for beneficial insects. And for instance, in vegetables, the aphids that go to, let's say, a grain type of cover crop, let's say a cereal like oats or rye or even wheat, those aphids do not go to the vegetables. And so then what ends up happening is that beneficial insects going into the cover crop before it's knocked down, they build up their populations on these aphids that are in the cover crop, and then they become a source of beneficial insects for the crop, and that's a good thing. And then, of course, they reduce erosion, improve water quality of runoff, and you get less sediment movement and all of those things. Those are kind of well-known aspects of cover crops. Now, of course, there are some drawbacks to the use of cover crops. They have an additional cost if you're buying the seed and planting it, and tilling it and so forth. These are costs, and so the growers may shy away from that, and so that's something that needs to be acknowledged. But they also require it's an additional practice that takes time and management, and maybe at a time when the grower is preoccupied with like harvesting their crops or doing other practices. So that can get in the way. they might even increase specific insects and pest diseases. We've seen this in vegetables, like with some of the vetches will tend to be hosts for certain soil-borne diseases. And so what we've seen is vegetable growers in here, they don't tend to use a lot of legumes in their cover crops because they're afraid of the potential for some of these cover crops actually increasing insects and, well, diseases. Some cover crops, if they're not grown properly, with the right seeding rate and timing and spacing and all that, actually some of the weeds might grow up within the cover crop and set seed. And this could be a problem. I'm not sure it's a problem in the orchards, but in vegetable crops, this is a concern. And so, growers have to take precautions to deal with, try and outcompete the weeds, by using higher seeding rates or very competitive cover crops to compete out the weeds. And then the other aspect of cover crops is that because they're a growing crop, and in our Mediterranean climate, and so we have the same climate here in California that you have in Chile, so I'm not sure the situation in your area, but here the cover crops may tend to reduce the amount of water that's in the soil in the spring, and so that could be an issue for you, depending on your situation, and you might have to manage for that kind of a situation, and maybe try and terminate the growth of the cover crop so it doesn't use as much water from the soil profile. If you're depending on that to, especially in a perennial crop like tree crops, that soil water, of course, is very important for the initial water needs of the crop. So now we'll just talk a little bit about some of the specifics of cover crops. Cover crop timing, as I mentioned, in California, where we have a Mediterranean climate, a lot of times what you'll see is, most of the time, what you'll see is growers are growing the cover crops during the rainy winter months, and the cover crop is fed by the winter rains, and that's where it gets its water, so that there's no managerial need to supply the crop with irrigation water to keep it growing, and so that simplifies the whole process of growing the cover crop. That's the ideal scenario. You plant the cover crop, winter rains come, you grow the cover crop, and then you incorporate it in the spring. Now, you will see situations, and we have growers that grow summer cover crops during the warm time of the year, but of course those need to be irrigated. And just, what are some of the common cover crop types? The most common is the cereals. This would include, in our area, the Merced rye, the triticales, oats, in some cases wheat, barley. These types of cover crops, and they're just a cereal. They don't fix nitrogen. They just produce a lot of biomass, and they have different times of maturity. So a lot of times growers will choose later maturing types of cover crops so that the cover crop doesn't go to seed and become an actual weed problem. Again, that's more of a concern for vegetables. One thing I've seen is in vineyards, I should mention, here in Monterey County, we're mostly a vegetable producing area, but we have a fair number of acres of wine grapes. And so I have worked, to some extent in the cover crops in vineyards. And sometimes if people are growing a cereal, like something like wheat or triticale, we have a pretty good sized seed, then it becomes a habitat for mice. And you can actually have quite an explosion of rodent population with the use of these cereal cover crops. Now, one way that growers have gotten around that is they use other kinds of grasses. So something like blando brome is a very small seeded annual grass. It's not a cereal. It's not grown for food production. It's just a ryegrass is another one. So there's other options, to get around this rodent issue. Legumes. In this case here, this is bell beans, but there's so many different types of legumes. There's vetches, clovers, peas, things like that. And again, chosen depending on the needs of the grower. And but this is of particular interest. Excuse me, fighting a cold. These varieties are chosen to build up the nitrogen in the soil, and that's of great benefit to organic production, for instance. As I mentioned, in vegetables, some of these varieties are not used because of their being a host for some diseases that go to some of the vegetables. But in tree crops, I've never heard that being the case. So these are very, very useful species. And a lot of times what you see is growers will mix cereals and legumes together. There's a very common mix that's used here. It's an oats with bell beans, peas, and vetch. And they called it, one of the seed companies calls it Soil Builder. And they sell that, and it's used quite extensively. And then another type is mustards. Mustards are used in vegetable systems to some degree. They're used in I haven't seen them used too much in vineyards, but occasionally you'll see them used, and they're very fast growing, and they have certain benefits to the production system, and so that's another type. And then now I should mention these are all cool season. These are grown during the winter months, and then if you get into the warm season, then you'll see people a lot of times will plant something like cowpeas, and there's many varieties of cowpeas. One of the real common things you'll see people do here is they'll grow Sudan grass or the sorghum Sudan hybrids as a cover crop, or buckwheat. But there's many others. One thing that is starting to happen now, I mean, we've even seen people grow things like safflower, sunflowers, flax, all kinds of interesting, people are, kind of really interested in exploring some other species, to use as cover crops. I think it's all good. People should be trying things. And so there's many other ideas that are out there that people are using. Now, I talked a little bit, but let me just go into a few more details about these. The cereals. The thing that's nice about them is they have an intensive root system that's good at capturing residual nitrate in the soil, and then they reduce nitrate leaching. They capture that nitrogen, keep it in the plant biomass, and then once the plant is tilled or or mowed or whatever, then that becomes slowly available as a source of nitrogen to subsequent crops, kind of a slow, steady form of nitrogen as it decomposes. And as I mentioned, the legumes, they're in association with soil-borne bacteria. They have nodules on the roots where nitrogen from the air is transformed into plant-available forms of nitrogen. I already mentioned that. And then the mustards are very fast growing. And, there's a lot of people that have taken a look at mustards to see, can they suppress certain soil-borne diseases? And this idea is got a lot of support, mostly in the area of nematodes suppression. Not so much in the area of disease suppression, but people talk about that quite a bit. But we haven't really seen it. But in terms of nematodes, there is probably some benefit from the mustards. Now, when we talk about cover crop configurations, and so this is a slide from a project that I did a few years ago. We were working in a vineyard, and we were planting different kinds of cover crops and comparing them with no cover crop, and looking at the effect of the cover crop on the soil. We measured it. In fact, if you're interested, if you go to, you can Google California agriculture, and that's a magazine that the university puts out. We published all this information, and just search Richard Smith, and hopefully you'll find a bunch of things. But if you type my name in vineyard or something, this article will come up. But now I think this is probably similar to how you're growing the tree fruit in Chile, where you have in the middles here is where you grow the cover crop, and then under the vine or the tree row, you have weed control. Now, in our climate, this is very, very important because of the the water issue. As I mentioned, we don't have an excess of water, and so controlling the cover crop under the vine row, there's less competition with the crop. But this is a configuration I think you're all familiar with in tree fruit or vines. In row crops, in vegetables, of course, we just plant the whole area, finish with the vegetables, disc everything, plant the cover crop across the whole field, and then grow it, and then disc it and incorporate it and get everything ready for vegetables. Here's kind of a specific example. This is some work we did looking at cover crops in strawberries. And we tried different kinds of cover crops, and this was to help reduce erosion loss and to help build up soil organic matter and in the furrows during the winter period. And then this would all be controlled either with an herbicide or just by people stepping on them, in the spring when they start harvesting strawberries. Now, one thing I'm going to mention, and this is something that a lot of people might say, what are you mentioning that for? Well, the reality is, when, here in Monterey County, in the vines, we have probably 95% of the acreage gets a cover crop. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? And it might even be 100%. Most people are all in on cover crops, but they're not necessarily going out there and planting a cover crop. They're just letting the resident vegetation be the cover crop. So in other words, letting the weeds, the annual grasses, the shepherd's purse and all these different weeds, let them be in the middle, and they'll spray out under the vine row. And so this is how they are managing cover in the vineyard. And so as it turns out, some of these weeds actually have pretty good benefits. Something like malva has a deep root and can create channels to encourage water infiltration. Burr clover is a vetch, and the vetches are nitrogen fixation. The grasses, some of the annual grasses, have fibrous root systems that build organic matter. And if there's any wild mustards out there, they have deep roots and control possibly diseases and nematodes. So you can't underestimate the benefit of just the resident vegetation in an orchard system. Now, in vegetables, of course, we would never do this, because then all you're doing is inoculating the field with weed seed, and that's totally counterproductive. But in a situation like a vineyard or an orchard, it probably is something to consider and something to look at, because there's definitely, even though we might discount, oh, it's just a weed. Well, some of these weeds actually have quite a bit of value. Now, here's just some data on the different cover crops and how productive they are. And this is some studies that I did, over a 6-year average. When we compared all the cereals, all the different kinds of cereals, we had probably, I don't know, half a dozen different cereals, and we had different legumes, and then we also had some cereal legume mixes, and we had mustards. What we see is that the biomass, the cereals are clearly have the highest biomass. Legumes tended to be a little less productive, but they're very good at fixing their own nitrogen. The cereal legume mixes give you a benefit. They have they're pretty productive, and they also provide a lot of nitrogen. And then the mustards are they can also be highly productive, but on average in these studies they were about half as productive as the cereals, but they did take up a lot of nitrogen. So they're very good at scavenging nitrogen from the soil. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that when you're managing the cover crop and trying to decide when to knock it down, when to incorporate it, or when to mow it, when to terminate the cover crop, and if it's a cereal or a grass of some sort, allowing it to mature as long as you can, it'll give you a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. And because as the plant is maturing, the percent of nitrogen is declining relative to the percent of carbon, so the carbon nitrogen ratio goes up. And what's beneficial about that is that the high carbon are good for building soil organic matter, because the lignin and the high C to N residues, they provide the building blocks of organic matter. And so what they'll provide is a slow, steady source of nitrogen that becomes available over time for crop growth. It won't be a big burst of nitrogen, but it'll be, initially you'll get a bit of a burst, but over time it'll be a slow, steady release of nutrients that come from the cover crop. And so they have a longer lasting effect on soil tilt. And I think soil tilt is really what you're interested in, from what they can provide for your cover crop, because the soil tilt has so many impacts in terms of managing the soil. And then here's just some studies. If you there's a researcher here at the USDA Eric Brennan, who's done a lot of really great studies on cover crops. He's dedicated basically his whole career to just working on cover crops. And this is a study that he did where he sampled. So this rye is a cereal cover crop, and then here's a cereal rye with a legume. This is a mix. Here's the legume component, here's the rye, and then if you just take the whole thing together, and then this is a mustard, and then he sampled it at December, January, February. What he saw is that by February, March, the rye alone had the highest. This is the carbon nitrogen ratio. So if you're getting up to about 30 carbon nitrogen ratio, that's getting to be pretty high. And so it becomes more resistant, and it'll stick around in the soil longer. And if you look at the legumes by themselves, they tend to have a lower carbon nitrogen ratio. So they're going to actually release nitrogen fairly quickly. And so that is a benefit if you want a release of nitrogen from your cover crop. Then the legumes might be the way to go. And then in that same mix, these cereal rye didn't get as high because they probably were getting nitrogen from the cover crop, from the legume cover crop. And so when you looked at the combination of the legume and the rye, they tended to have a lower C to N ratio of about 20, which is going to release kind of on a slow to intermediate level. And interestingly, the mustards also tend to keep a kind of a moderate level of carbon nitrogen ratio, and they don't generally tend to result in these high C to N ratios. So, like for instance, just to give an example from my own situation, where I live, we have a very sandy soil. So in my garden, I use cereal cover crops. And the reason is I want that residue to stay there as long as possible. I used to use a lot of legumes, but really what I really want is I want residue to stay in the soil, because sandy soils tend to lose organic matter quicker than a heavier soil. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that high C to N ratio of the cereals, and of some of the weeds, some of the annual grasses and so forth, is a benefit for building soil organic matter. And this question comes up a lot. What if you, and I know it would in an orchard system, like if they're going to mow off the cover crop and just leave it on the soil surface. And what we see is that rather than disking it in, if you were to disk in the residue, then it's going to break down more quickly, because it all just needs soil contact, right? And with moisture. And so just leaving the residue on the surface as a mulch slows that whole process down. And the mulch on the soil surface is of benefit because it cools the soil. And now, one thing that might happen is that those surface applied residues might be more vulnerable to nitrogen loss via volatilization. But in general, that's a viable way of handling cover crop residue, is just leaving it on the surface as a mulch. But keeping in mind that it, you might lose some of the nitrogen from it, and it's breaking down slowly because it doesn't have as good of contact with the soil, moist soil. Now, one thing that's very important, we were talking about, the impact of cover crops on soil tilth. Here's from that study we did in the vineyard. Here is where we had a rye cover crop, and then here is where there was no cover crop. And you can see the cover crop is allowing the water to infiltrate into the soil. Whereas here, because of the nature of the soil, they were getting ponding of the water. And so it's not infiltrating because the tilt of the soil isn't good. And so the cover crop helped improve the tilt of the soil to get infiltration. And that's all good, right? You want that water in the soil. And then, as I mentioned, though, in the spring, these cover crops may use water. And then here's just one study that we did. And what we did, in this study, what we were doing is we were looking at the effect of the cover crop in the middles and the effect of the cover crop under the vine row. And so here we measured the moisture content of the soil under, we had Bayer, we had a Merced rye, and then we had a Trios. So these are two different cereals. The Trios is later maturing. The rye is much earlier maturing. And what we saw in the middles is that as the season, as we started to go from May to June to July, that's the opposite of you guys. I know. This is our summer. This is your winter. But what we saw was that this later maturing cover crop was using a lot of water. It had lower moisture content in the soil. In the middles, in the vine row, there was very, very slight differences, and they didn't appear to be that big a deal. So the effect in the vine row was much less than in the middle. So that little bit of a buffer between the middles and the vine row seemed to be mitigated, by just the little bit of distance. And so the cover crops, they did have an effect. They were lower than the Bayer, but not dramatically so. Now, when we talk about runoff, I don't know if runoff is an issue in your areas, but in this same exact trial, we had, the Bayer, the Merced rye, and the Trios. We measured, suspended solids and turbidity in the runoff. And what you can see is that the cover crops greatly reduce, suspended solids and turbidity in the cover crops. And then this is from a whole different study. This is on vegetable ground. But what I love about this data is that you can see that, again, here we had rye and we had the Trios triticale and then a Bayer. And what you see is this is runoff, and 42% of the rainfall, 47% of the rainfall ran off. And then there's the gallonage, about 120,000 gallons. And then where we had the rye and the triticale, it was greatly reduced. So it vastly improved infiltration of that water into the soil. So that is pretty amazing. And then, of course, everybody wants to know, did the cover crops increase organic matter content? And here in this study that we were doing in the early 2000s, we had, the Bayer, the Merced rye, and the Trios. What we saw was that we tended to have, statistically significant over 3 years higher organic matter. Not surprising. That's what you would expect. And there it is. And but what was interesting is that if you look at the vine row, having, here we compared just the Merced rye. Here's in the middles, it had higher carbon in the soil. We're measuring carbon here. But even having the cover crop in the middles increased carbon under the vine row. And kind of got to wonder how that could be, but it's possible the roots are getting over there, and the roots are organic matter, and that they're improving the quality of the soil, even where you don't have the cover crop growing. So that's pretty interesting. And then just a few comments about, nitrogen release from cover crops. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but here's a real nice slide a colleague of mine put together on the release of nitrogen from different cover crops. So here she's showing, different kinds of straw, rye, wheat, oat straw, corn stalks, and so forth. And then when you get to, the carbon nitrogen ratio, when it's this high, I mean, it's just releasing very, very slowly, like a tortoise. But, when you get to, things that have a carbon nitrogen ratio of 13, remember we were talking about that, like here's legumes, 20 to 1, they're releasing the nitrogen much faster. And you could rely upon that as a source of nitrogen for your crop growth. And then here's just a different way of displaying it. So like if you look at the nitrogen percent in your cover crop, what's interesting is that, even a cover crop that has a nitrogen percent of 3 to 5%, it doesn't release all of the nitrogen. And this is an interesting thing about organic materials in general. You'll tend to see a very fast release in the first 4 to 6 weeks, and then it kind of starts slowing way down. And so all of the easily decomposed materials in that cover crop become available in the first 4 to 6 weeks. And then after that, they really slow down, and then they start acting like organic matter, and they don't release very much. And so in this graph, what they're basically showing is that 35 to almost 60% of the nitrogen that was released, but it was mostly released here by the time you got to the 6 to 8 weeks out, and then it slows way down. You can see some of these lines get very, very, very flat. And then actually some of these materials, if their carbon nitrogen ratio, or in this case, the percent nitrogen, which translates to carbon nitrogen ratio as well, actually they tie up nitrogen and don't release it. So that is something you do have to be aware of. If you're relying on the cover crop as a source of nitrogen, then you probably don't want it to get to a high C to N ratio. And then this table basically, what it's showing you is that, based on the nitrogen content, what percent of that nitrogen that's in there becomes released. And so if we see something that has a nitrogen content of like 4.7, it's releasing about 55% of the nitrogen is becoming available. If it's something like cayuse oats, where it got pretty mature, maybe only 10% of the nitrogen that contains becomes available. Now, it's not like it's all lost. It's just that to rely upon it for a fast release of nitrogen, to fertilize a crop is probably not a good idea. You'll get the nitrogen that it contains, the 90% that's not released becomes available over time, but it's very slow and steady. It acts like soil organic matter. And just winding down now, this is just to show you if you are in a situation where you're concerned about nitrate leaching, cover crops this is cumulative amount of nitrate leached. What we see is that the cover crops, they're not perfect because, some of the nitrate before the plants get big enough to capture all the nitrate might get past the root system, but they greatly reduce compared to bare fallow. They greatly reduce nitrate leaching. So just in summary, cover crops, they help improve the quality and productivity of the soil. They help cycle or augment nutrients and manage soil water. Very important. They can provide biological benefits, stimulating soil microbial activity and possibly suppressing some diseases or nematodes. And then, if you remember nothing else from this talk, you do have to be, kind of educate yourself about, selecting cover crops, the right cover crops, and allowing them to mature to the proper stage, so that then you can get your benefit from them. So I will stop there, and I will stop sharing and answer any questions. I see there is a question in the chat.
Hola, sí, Richard, gracias. Muchas gracias por tu presentación. Vamos a ver el tema de las preguntas. Todavía pueden dejar preguntas en el botoncito. Así que aprovechen esta instancia para poder responder alguna de sus dudas. Tenemos una pregunta de Lucy Ascuy, que dice que no le quedó claro qué pasaba cuando se ciega la cobertura y queda como mulch en el suelo, y este se va incorporando lentamente. ¿Eso no es conveniente? Pregunta Lucy.
Yeah. Well, it depends on your farming situation, but like in an orchard, leaving a mulch on the soil surface is probably very good. I mean, here in the vineyards, that's basically how they manage the cover crops. Is they just mow them in the spring. They let them get to a certain height, and then they mow them down and just leave it as a mulch in the row middles. In vegetables, you wouldn't do that. I mean, here we don't do that, because we're growing a lot of things like lettuce, broccoli, with small seed, and so we have to have perfect, beds that are prepared, where you can seed very carefully and get germinate up the seed, and so we don't leave mulches in vegetable situations, but in orchard situations, yes, I think it's very good.
Gracias, Richard.
Leo la de Hugo.
Sí,
Nico.
porfa, que no,
Ya.
se me
Sí,
perdió
no, la pregunta, sí. Mire, Richard, Hugo pregunta qué piensas acerca, la escribe en inglés, pero en español pregunta qué piensas acerca de usar los cultivos de cobertera entre las hileras y la paja dejarla en la hilera.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Actually, there's actually pieces of equipment that Veda Farming has a piece of equipment. They call it mow and blow, where you mow the cover crop and then they blow it over onto the vine row or the orchard row, tree row, and that can be done. It might complicate weed control. I haven't worked with it myself, but you'd have to see how it affects your weed control, because typically, the pre-emergent herbicides they use in trees or in vines, they like to have a clean soil, get the herbicide down. But the the cutting and putting the straw down, you could do that after you've put, used your herbicides. And so that would be good. It's an interesting idea. We don't have very many people that have done that here, but I know it is something that people are interested in to try and get the carbon, because this is what we always thought was a little strange. In, when you look at those situations, you have the vine row clean, right? And then you have the row middles, cover crop. Now, don't you want all those benefits from that cover crop also under the vine, or under the tree row? So I think what you're getting at is you're trying to get those benefits over under the plants, and that's a good thing. And don't give up on it. It's a great idea. That's all I can say.
Gracias, Richard. Tenemos otra pregunta de José Miguel Parragués. Él dice si puedes dar un ejemplo para suelos arcillosos, que colocar una cobertura con qué especies que profundice en el suelo. Si puedes dar un ejemplo de alguna mezcla para esa situación en particular.
Okay. So in a very clay soil, I think as long as there's drainage, you can grow really any cover crop. I think what happens with clay soils is if they're not well drained, then that's when you start running into trouble with cover crops. And the first thing you take off the list would be mustards. They do not like poorly drained soils. Some of the cereals, like the cereal rye, can handle heavier soils that don't have as good a drainage. A lot of the legumes won't handle poor drainage very well. So that is, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I've seen. We grow beautiful cover crops on a well-drained clay soil here. That's not the problem. It's the drainage is the problem.
Gracias, Richard.
¿Sigo con la
Juan
otra
Carlos.
yo? ¿Sí?
Sí, dime.
Ya, la siguiente pregunta, sí, pregunta Cristóbal Crespo. Si han medido el efecto de la cobertura vegetal en la refracción de la luz para evitar el quemado de la fruta. Sí, ahí yo quisiera agregar,
No.
antes, quisiera agregar algo, porque Richard mencionó de que la temperatura del suelo efectivamente baja, pero el reflejo de la radiación, ¿tiene algún efecto en el microclima en los árboles que están ahí?
Yeah, wow. That's a great question. I do know. Well, I have not worked with that, so I don't really know very much about that, but I have heard about that, where you get reflection up, and then you can actually, on some very sensitive crops, usually it's a pretty sensitive crop, can have burning issues. But I'm probably not really the right person to ask that question. That's a good question though. I'd like to know the answer myself.
Sí, sí, gracias Richard. La siguiente pregunta, volvemos con Hugo, Hugo habló sobre poner la paja sobre la hilera. Entonces él dice
Cuenta su experiencia acá.
claro, es que se dio cuenta que han tenido un buen control de malezas con este método, y además usan menos agua vía riego por goteo. Es como su experiencia.
Sí, y abajo sigue
Ah,
como
sí.
complementando, que
Ah, sí, no me
normalmente
había dicho.
ellos dejan la cobertura entre hileras, en la primavera y el verano, y ellos ciegan,
Ujú,
¿sí?
sí, sigan.
Y evitan el que compita el árbol frutal por agua y nutrientes. Y dice que ha funcionado muy bien para suelos arcillosos.
Yeah. Well, that's Hugo, you're hitting on all the important aspects of having that cover crop on the soil. Because I mean, I didn't mention it, but if you're using drip, that drip is hitting the soil and it's compacting. And what a lot of times what happens is it runs off instead of going down into the soil. And so if you have some kind of cover there, that eases that issue, and you get better infiltration. And so I think you are absolutely correct. We actually looked at trying to get cover crops growing under the vine rows, but we had to abandon it because the growers had no interest in it. I think it was too complicated for weed control, and it was timing and all of these aspects really kept the growers from having any enthusiasm for that idea. But one thing we did notice was that where we did grow cover crop under the vine row, and then we killed it with like glyphosate or some herbicide, where those drip emitters were dripping, you had much better infiltration. So I think you're absolutely correct.
Gracias, Richard. Juan Carlos, ¿tiene alguna otra
Sí,
duda?
sí, yo quisiera agregar una pregunta ya en mía, muy relacionado con alguien preguntaba sobre los suelos arcillosos, especies recomendadas. Yo quiero enfocarla desde otro punto de vista. ¿Existen especies que que tengan por su arquitectura radical, por la forma que crecen las raíces, algunas crecen más pivotantes, más derecho hacia abajo, y otras crecen más hacia los lados? ¿Existen algunas especies que crezcan más profundamente? Estamos hablando de huertos frutales, donde el sistema de raíces es más grande. Entonces, quizás yo necesito que estas plantas tengan un sistema radical bien profundo. ¿Es posible que algún grupo de especies tenga raíces más profundas que otras? Y si es así, ¿cuáles serían estas?
You know, I this is the best answer I can give on that question because it's a very good question. We measured in vegetables. We measured rooting depth of vegetables, and so when we talk about that, we're talking about lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, and what we saw is that vegetables their roots grow at about half an inch a day. And so like a crop like lettuce that's out there for 60 days, its roots get down to about 30 inches. And if it's a crop like broccoli that's out there for 80 days, then the roots get down there to 40 inches. If it's a crop like Brussels sprouts that are out there for like 150 days, then their roots get down to 75 inches, 6 feet. And so I have never measured the rooting depth of cover crop roots, but I don't have any reason to believe they don't grow any different than that. But that's just a guess on my part. And but I think if you think about like a mustard, they have a strong taproot, so their taproot's going to be very strong and go down, and then they'll have some side roots, but there'll be the emphasis on that taproot. Whereas something like the cereals, they're going to have an intensive, extensive root system. No taproot, just fibrous rooting going down. And you can kind of see that when you dig them up, how the roots went. So, but in terms of, I don't know. I think it would be interesting. And actually, this is something I wanted to do before I retired, but I never did, was to measure rooting depth of cover crops. I think that would be so interesting to know. Are they growing in the way that we observed the vegetables growing? I kind of suspect they do. I don't see why they wouldn't. Because it's funny when you took all those vegetables, you put them all on the same graph. They were all growing at the same rate, and if it all just depended on how long they were in the ground. Now, one thing that came up is if the soil had a hard layer, the roots would come down to that hard layer and then they would go flat across that hard layer. And so you hear people talking about cover crops breaking up hard pans. I'm a little suspicious of that. I don't know, because in my experience, I'm not sure. Well, we never observed that. We watched roots come down, they hit a hard layer, and then they go along it. I never saw them go through it. Not that they couldn't, if they found a weak spot, I'm sure they could. So that's my thoughts on that.
Gracias, Richard. Tenemos una última pregunta de la tarde de Johan, que dice, pensando en que todos estos cultivos establecidos entre hilera extraen nutrientes, ¿cuál sería el momento ideal para ajustar los programas de fertilización?
Well, that is a good question. I'm not a fruit person, so I don't really know when you need to fertilize, like apples or plums or whatever. I assume in the spring. And a lot of times what I've seen, in vines, they're fertilizing through the drip. And so that is going into the crop row, and that's where the bulk of the fertilizer is going. When we measured, looking at roots in that vineyard, most of the roots were under that clean surface of soil, where there was no weeds or any competition. Most of the roots were there. There were some going out into the row middles, but not very much. But that was just in the situation that we were in. So I'm not sure, how much of a competition the row middles for nutrients are if you're fertilizing in that way, where you're putting the nutrients right there, and if most of the roots are there. That would be something, maybe your research community down there knows more about that than I do. But in general, it's a very good question. And so I don't have a good answer for you about it, other than that's what I've seen, when you fertilize, right there under the plant row, the roots are going to get it. And so the competition from the row middles is probably less of a factor. That's my thought.
Gracias, Richard. Juan Carlos.
¿Leo esa?
Sí, ahora sí la última pregunta.
Ahora la última. Vuelve Hugo, Richard. Yo no sé si es una afirmación o una pregunta, entonces hay que entender bien. Que dice que se puede complementar el cultivo de cobertera en los suelos arcillosos con la aplicación de ácidos húmicos y fúlvicos, y también con la aplicación de calcio con la idea de mejorar la estructura del suelo. ¿Alguna idea o pensamiento acerca
Yo creo que es un comentario. Yo creo que es más comentario que pregunta, de su experiencia.
Yeah, Well, I mean, look, I think all those things, when it comes to soil management, you have to do everything, right? So calcium is very important for soil tilth, you know. Um, those humic and fulvic acid products, they're helpful. They probably need to be used every year for many years to really see benefits because usually people are putting on small amounts. Um, and then really the things that make dramatic difference are things like cover crops and compost. Those two things, because you're putting a lot of organic matter into the soil and stimulating the soil microbial activity. And so, those two things, like if you look at some of the studies that were done around here, compost gave the most long-lasting carbon in the soil. If you look at those papers by Eric Brennan, you can go to his website and look at some of the papers that he wrote on that. And so I think for me, I would put the emphasis on compost and cover crops. Of course, calcium is very important. And then those products like the fulvic acid and all that, that's great. But I don't think that's what's making the dramatic difference. That's just my opinion.
Ok, muchas gracias Richard. Bueno, con esta pregunta terminamos la charla de hoy. Agradezco tu tiempo, tu presentación, muchas gracias. Y los dejo invitados a todos a también al día de campo que vamos a tener sobre este tema, que va a ser la próxima semana, el jueves 28, en Curicó, donde vamos a estar viendo en terreno el uso y los beneficios del uso de cultivos de cobertura con Carlos Sabaini. Así que lo dejo invitado a inscribirse a este día de campo. Me pueden escribir un correo a mí directamente o en el formulario que yo he mandado a través del correo electrónico. Así que los dejo. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por su participación. Gracias Juan Carlos, gracias Richard, gracias Sebastián, el traductor. Y que tengan una muy buena tarde. Así que nos vemos en otra ocasión. Chao.